The day my life changed began with a single scrap of paper and a laugh I would never forget. She held it up as if it were a blessing, and it sounded like a verdict. In the kitchen where I had placed my mug, she laughed and said, "We are done with you." Those words landed heavier than the mug against the counter. If you are listening now, tell me the city you are watching from in the comments. I want to know who is with me. My name is Hattie, 67 years old, widow, and the woman who paid this mortgage with 2 jobs and thrift jars. I raised my son David here, shelled peas at this very table, ironed shorts on this ironing board, and kept a small folded note in the cookie jar that I thought only I knew about. In a few minutes, you will hear how that same folded note became the reason I was shoved out of my own home, how signatures and receipts appeared where they should not, and how a truth no one wanted tore my family apart. If this moves you, press like so the story finds others who need to hear it. The air that morning smelled of burned toast and rain on hot pavement, and the sound of her laughter made the steam from my tea feel like smoke. But there was a question I could not stop asking, even as my hands shook. Did she read the name on the back of that note? My childhood was small and loud and rooted in a small coastal town called Ridgeview, where the grocery store was run by Mr. Ellis and the school bell was a church bell. My parents worked different shifts, and I learned to be at once cautious with money and generous with what little I had. When I was a girl, I collected shells and saved coins in a tin that had a painted cow. By the time I was 20, I had apprenticed at a tailor shop, learned to sew straight seams under pressure, and married a kind man named Peter who made clocks and told terrible jokes. Peter and I built a life that was steady rather than flashy. We bought this house the year our son David was born. He arrived with a shock of dark hair and a temper that made me laugh and worry in equal measure. We named him for his grandfather. For 35 years, I mended hymns, balanced ledgers for a small cleaning business, and kept a ledger for household expenses that smelled faintly of lavender. There were winters when the heating bill was a sharp fear, and summers when a single watermelon could feed 3 neighbors. Our routine became rituals. I made coffee at 6 every morning. Peter polished his watch at 7. David learned to load the dishwasher so late at night he would study by the glow from the street lamp. When Peter died unexpectedly, at 58 from a stroke, the world contracted to the size of our porch and the smell of his shaving cream. Grief taught me how to manage pain and how to be practical at the same time. I kept the house because it was all we had left as a family anchor. I took a job cleaning at the hospital and another part-time folding shirts at a nearby laundry. I learned which lights used the least electricity and how to patch a roof with a kindness from a neighbor. The note in the cookie jar was written by Peter once, a silly little thing about saving for a boat we never bought. I kept it because the curl of his handwriting made me feel safe. That old habit of saving was how, slowly and without glamour, I built a small reserve. The reserve lived in a locked tin behind a photo of our wedding, labeled by me as "rainy day" in a trembling script. I never considered it more than a cushion for bad winters. I never imagined any of it would become a rope to be pulled from beneath me. Our neighborhood knew our names. Rosa at number 8 waved from her porch with a watering can. Ben at the corner store handed me extra change once when the loaf of bread fell short. Reverend Paul led funerals and always asked about David. Those familiar faces blurred the day change crept into something cruel. My son David was a broad man with gentleness at his edges and a habit of apologizing when it was unnecessary. He had married Anna 8 years earlier, a woman with bright ideas and a way of organizing the pantry that made me smile. At first, I liked Anna. She was energetic and she made lists I could admire. But lists can become maps that exclude new paths. Over the years, tensions threaded through quiet dinners and small disagreements about bills and furniture. They were not huge fights. They were the kind of frets that live like moths in a sleeve. Sometimes she said we should sell the house and move closer to her work. Sometimes she would suggest my spending was careless. I told myself differences were normal. What I did not see was how tightly Anna began to pull at the strings that held our family together. She started showing more interest in our small savings, asking casual questions about where we kept receipts, about whether Peter had left anything formal. I told her, as I would tell you now, we had nothing big. We had thrift jars, a few bonds from the 70s that paid little, and a folded note that was a joke. I trusted my son to protect me. Trust can be mistaken for weakness. Looking back now, I see small signals. A ledger she kept under the sink that did not match the receipts in our files. A phone call she took in the closet with the door closed. A comment about how nice it would be to pay off debts with one sweep. Those were not reasons to fear, I told myself, just a friction of two households learning to live together. My backstory is this: steady work, thrift, small joys, and the belief that love and patience would hold the rest. The day that started the cascade was ordinary. I had folded a towel and set it on the radiator. The rain had left the driveway spotted like a hand pressed in water. David came in early from work, soaked at the cuffs. He was grinning unwisely, the way one grins at a private joke. Anna followed with a paper bag from the corner store, her cheeks bright and her eyes too quick. She said, "Look what we found." She pulled from the bag an old lottery ticket that was faded at the edges. She held it up between her fingers like a photograph. David laughed and slapped her hand away as if to keep the joke private. I remember the way the paper felt, thin and dry, and how the fluorescent light caught the ink to make it look like a promise. I asked, "Is that from here, from the jar?" She said, "We picked it up from under the counter like it was a treasure." At first I laughed. Then David said, "We are going to cash it in." The room smelled of wet wool and the humidity of the house. That was the moment Anna smiled in a way I had not seen before, the smile that kept a secret. She said, "We do not need to talk about selling anything. We can make this easy." I asked, "What do you mean by easy?" She answered, "You will just move in with my sister for a while." Those words seemed odd. I asked, "For how long?" She shrugged and said, "Until we set everything up." I laughed to keep a tremor from my voice and asked where Peter would be if he were here. "Why would you bring him up?" Anna said sharply. David put a hand on my shoulder like a pause. He said, "Mom, breathe. You will be fine." The ticket felt light in Anna's fingers and heavy in my stomach. There was a small scuffle over the counter as David put the ticket into his pocket, then a ringing phone, then Anna calling their neighbor about a celebratory drink. I stood there with my mug cooling in my hands and a simple question in my head that would later make people lean in toward the truth. Who wrote the name on the back? By the end of the day, I was not yet an exile. The first small cut came when items began to disappear from their places. At dinner, the silver spoons I had used for 20 years were missing. I asked, and Anna said, "We are borrowing what we need for now." I believed it as if it were a temporary loan. The humiliation started as small adjustments and then became a pattern. One morning I woke to find a box of my clothes at the end of the drive, not yet in the rain, but tamped like an invitation. I asked David why, and he said, "It will be tidier for everyone." His voice had strain in it that I had not heard before. I remember the shock like a physical presence, the scrape of cardboard, the smell of dust, and the thinness of the mattress they expected I would take with me. There were neighbors who saw me carrying a small suitcase and who looked away. Rosa offered tea, but did not ask too many questions. Ben from the corner store lowered his eyes when I passed, as if the familiarity was an awkward wait. Anna stood at the doorway with the ticket folded in her hand and said, "This is better for everyone." It felt like being invited to leave my own life. I said, "You cannot do this, David. This is my home." He said, "We will help you find somewhere." He sounded like a man performing a mercy while holding a bill. The sense of betrayal was not loud at first. It was a small, grainy sound against the window, like someone tapping the glass slowly until it cracked. I remember looking back once as I closed the door and seeing the photo of Peter on the mantel, his smile like an afterimage. I tucked that photo under my arm because I could not leave it behind and because some objects refused to be abandoned. After the first shock came a period that I call my exile. I packed what I could carry, a mixture of practical things and the small talismans of memory. I slept on a futon in a rented room above a laundromat where the machines hum like distant seas. The room smelled of detergent and late-night coffee. I kept the photo of Peter in my sweater pocket and the folded note in the tin where it had always been. The exodus was painful, but not aimless. I began to collect evidence in small ways. I kept receipts. I photographed the box of my clothes at the curb. I recorded a neighbor saying she had seen Anna carrying my silverware to her car. I opened jars in the pantry and found lipstick on a spoon that was not mine. I wrote down dates and times like a new calendar forming in my head. There was a temporary courage that came from being removed, a kind of clarity that pain sometimes brings. I spent evenings sorting through drawers to find any documents that could show ownership or payment history. In a desk drawer, I found an old envelope from the bank with canceled checks that had my name and Peter's. I took a photocopy at the public library and dated each copy with a small note. I cried into my pillow some nights and called Reverend Paul to ask for advice about next steps. He told me to trust facts, not emotions, when I could. I found the number for a local legal aid office and left a message with a calm voice that belied my shaking hands. I booked an appointment at a community clinic and found an attorney named Mark Harris who agreed to meet me. I rented a P.O. box to receive documents because I realized I could not trust that correspondence left at the house would reach me. I also walked to the corner store and asked Ben if he would be a witness about the silverware. He said yes with a small nod and a pause that said more than he could say. The verification phase required patience and a little bit of stubbornness. I spoke with the local bank, and Claire in the records department agreed to look up transactions related to the old account Peter and I had kept. She asked for a copy of any identification and proof of address. I provided photocopies of canceled checks and a property tax receipt. The bank's audit took 3 weeks and involved cross-checking signature samples against a signature on a purported transfer that had been submitted the week I was packing. The audit returned a troubling result. The signature on the transfer did not match Peter's known handwriting. Claire explained in clear terms how a signature analysis works for banking purposes. They compare pressure points, slant, and the formation of specific letters. She could not make a legal determination, but could flag the transaction for potential fraud. That explanation felt strangely clinical compared to the rawness of my loss. I also asked the local lottery office to check the ticket that Anna had waved like a flag at the kitchen table. The official I spoke with, named James, explained the process of validation. Tickets are verified by a serial number and barcode that link to the machine and timestamp. He checked and found anomalies in the timestamps and a suspicious void on a portion of the ticket where it appeared someone had attempted to alter a name. I recorded the phone call and requested an official statement. In parallel, my attorney, Mark, filed a request at the small claims clerk for a temporary injunction to prevent any transfer of property until ownership could be clarified. The legal paper was short and pointed. It required affidavits from me and from witnesses. I drafted my statement and included copies of the bank audit, the photocopied canceled checks, the receipt for property tax, and a photograph of the empty drawer with labels missing. The clerk stamped the papers with a loud thud that felt like an audible marker in my history. Legally, we were moving slowly, but I felt progress because I was moving the facts out of my head and into formal paperwork. There was also the financial forensic step, where a certified auditor traced the movement of funds. That process involved reviewing bank ledgers, checking deposits, and reconciling any transfers made to accounts linked to Anna. The auditor wrote a report explaining how transfers are matched by date, amount, and receiving account, and how digital traces often reveal the originating device. The report became a piece of evidence I would use in court. My first major moment of tension arrived when the temporary injunction hearing happened in a small room over the courthouse annex. The room smelt of coffee and paper, and the judge, Elena Morales, wore a calm face that gave nothing away. Anna arrived with a small group of people, including her sister Lisa and a man named Greg who spoke in words like a practice script. David sat beside Anna with a blank expression that made my chest tighten. The hearing consisted of short testimonies. I read my affidavit and handed the judge the pile of documents I had assembled. Anna stood and said, "We found the ticket and we are only protecting what is ours." Her voice was steady and sharp. The judge asked for proof of ownership. My attorney, Mark, presented the bank audit and the photocopied checks. He also described the signature analysis that Claire had flagged. Anna's counsel produced a notarized statement claiming discovery of the ticket and a signed note that, they said, showed consent for temporary housing transfer. The judge listened and then said she would issue a temporary hold on any large transfers until a full hearing. The line between hope and dread stepped forward. After the hearing outside the courthouse, Anna stepped close enough to me that I could smell her perfume, and she said quietly, "You should be grateful. You are lucky we are not doing worse." I felt my face burn, and the trust I had given to my son and my family flicker like a page in a breeze. This was the first true fracture that moved beyond words. In the weeks that followed, evidence accumulated into a slow, deliberate pressure. I obtained video footage from the corner store, showing Anna at the counter the day the ticket allegedly had been validated. The footage showed her hands, the ticket, a pause at the scanner, and later a hurried return to a vehicle where David was waiting. I printed frames and highlighted timestamps. I also found a delivery receipt that placed a package of my silverware in a vehicle registered to Anna's sister. I called the municipal clerk to request public records of calls to the house and found several calls from numbers linked to Anna placed on the day before I found my clothes at the curb. Each piece felt small alone, but together they began to reveal a pattern. I learned how to ask for a chain of custody for the ticket, how custody logs work to prove who handled physical evidence, and how an inconsistency in custody can render an item less credible. The forensic aspect of the ticket was handled at a state validation center where technicians examine barcodes under magnification and use ultraviolet light to detect tampering. The technician, a woman named Claire, not to be confused with the bank officer, ran the ticket under a lamplight and photographed the perforation patterns. Her report concluded there were signs of physical manipulation to the portion where a name had been written. That report was technical and precise, and it smelled faintly of laboratory cleaner and old paper. When I read it, I felt hope, as if the paper were finally speaking my truth. The second peak of tension came when David, my son, called me from the backseat of his car in a voice that tried to make itself small. He said, "Mom, Anna says you are making a scene. She is scared we will lose this chance." I asked him directly, "Did you ever sign anything?" He paused and then said, "No, I did not." The pause was a canyon. I asked, "Do you believe her?" He answered, "I do not know." Those words were a lightning strike. That night, I sat with Reverend Paul and we talked about forgiveness and boundaries. He told me that forgiveness without safety is not forgiveness at all. I felt both grief and a fierce clarity. I was ready to press on, to let the law unravel what my own family had become. I began to recruit witnesses deliberately. Rosa wrote a short affidavit about seeing boxes and hearing Anna talk about paying off debts. Ben at the store wrote down the times he saw Anna and David come in, excited and later carrying a small bag. Lisa, Anna's sister, at first refused to speak, but later provided a statement that contradicted Anna's earlier claim about the origin of the ticket. Each voice added a weight that made the narrative less one-sided. The confrontation I had prepared for finally arrived on a cold morning in a living room that used to be mine. We sat in a circle because the mediator insisted on a certain decorum. The room had a faint note of dust and lemon cleaner. Sunlight came through a curtain and made a strip of warmth on the rug. I had my folder of documents open on my lap. Anna had her arms crossed and a tight look at the corner of her mouth. David looked at his hands and avoided eye contact. Mark, my attorney, sat beside me and slid page after page in front of the mediator. The mediator said, "Let us begin." The confrontation was designed to be a sequence of clear disclosures. I had 5 to 8 people named in my documents who had witnessed things, and each one had been briefed. The dialogue began in a steady rhythm of questions and answers. I asked Anna, "Did you ever alter the ticket?" She said, "No." I had a frame from the store footage and asked, "Who brought the ticket to the store that morning?" Anna looked at David and said, "David did." I said, "David, you have been here longer than anyone else. Tell the truth." He swallowed and then said, "I was there, but Anna took the ticket and went to the counter." The room went quieter than a paused breath. I pressed on and asked, "Did you sign any documents that transferred ownership of the house?" Anna answered, "No, we only discussed plans." The mediator asked for the receipts in the chain of custody report. Mark read aloud the technician Claire's report about physical manipulation. Anna's face shifted. She said, "That is impossible. I did not do anything to the ticket." The mediator asked Anna directly, "Why did you tell my neighbors we were moving Mary out?" Anna said, "I was trying to avoid a fight." I asked, "Avoid a fight by throwing my things in the street?" Her jaw tightened and she said, "I am sorry you felt hurt." That apology was paper thin. I asked David, "Did you sign the transfer presented 2 weeks ago?" He said, "No," again with a timer of guilt in his voice. The exchange continued, with each of us handing a document, the mediator calling for testimony, and at one point, Anna pulled from her bag a notarized affidavit that had a signature dated 2 days after I found my clothes at the curb. Mark pointed out inconsistencies in the dates, and the notary stamp looked smudged. The mediator took a long look and said she would recommend a full hearing in the Superior Court. One of my tension peaks was the moment Anna, in front of everyone, accused me of lying about the contents of the tin. She said, "Maybe you hid more than you said." The words were meant to sting, and they did. My hands, which had been steady, began to shake. I answered, "I kept everything I could for rainy days. You have been living here. You know how I saved." She said, "You could not prove it." A nearby witness, Lisa, spoke up and said she had handled a box that contained a receipt with my name. Another witness, Ben from the store, said he had seen Anna carry a box to her car. The room turned into a chorus of small sounds that formed a larger argument. The mediator wrote notes and at one point looked at Anna with a patient but firm face and said, "We will bring the documents before a judge." The face of the mediator was a little like the face of the judge at the temporary injunction, the kind that does not lend itself to theatrics. The hearing date was set, and the calendar pages turned toward a day that felt like a judgment. Between the hearing and the full trial, I took a step that felt both practical and portentous. I started a small journal that detailed every conversation about the ticket, every time a plate was missing, every call I labeled each entry with a time and place. I made a list of neighbors and business owners who could testify, and I made sure their statements were notarized. I also started to prepare myself emotionally for the possibility that the law might not rule in my favor despite evidence. The courtroom is an imperfect beast, I told myself. Evidence can be reinterpreted, and the truth can be twisted by a convincing voice. So I practiced saying the truth out loud. I practiced naming what I had lost and what I wanted to preserve. That practice helped me speak without my voice cracking during testimony. I also reached out to a small local paper, the Ridgeview Gazette, and asked if a reporter might be interested in covering the human side of the case. A journalist named Carla came by and listened to my story with a steady pen. She wrote a piece that appeared in the regional column, and that piece made some neighbors call me with messages of support. When the day of the hearing came, I stepped into the court with a folder of exhibits and an ache in my chest that felt like a drum. The room echoed with the sound of footsteps and the rustle of paper. Judge Elena Morales presided again, and this time the room felt fuller. Anna had a lawyer who wore a blue suit and a quick patience. I sat at the table with Mark and watched as our lives were distilled into exhibits and affidavits. The judge called for order and the trial began. Mark opened with a clear statement about chain of custody, about the audited bank transfers, and about the forensic report on the ticket. He explained that the signature on a transfer did not match Peter's and that timestamps on store footage conflicted with Anna's account. Anna's lawyer argued that possession was a strong indicator and that the notarized statement proved discovery. The dialogue between the lawyers was sharp and precise, the kind that trims emotion into procedure. Each witness that I had collected was called. Rosa described seeing the boxes. Ben described the moment he had seen Anna loading silverware into a car with the license plate number he later recorded. Lisa testified that she had seen Anna take a portion of a ticket to a machine and then return with a different receipt. The clerk admitted the technician's report about the ticket manipulation with a photograph of the altered area. The judge listened, asked pointed questions, and at one moment leaned forward with interest. The final tension peak occurred when the judge asked David to stand and answer whether he had ever signed a document transferring the house. He stood, paused, and then said, "No, Your Honor, I did not sign." The courtroom felt like a held breath being released. Later, under cross-examination, Anna became flustered, and her story shifted in details about the times and who touched the ticket. The judge marked notes and, at the end of the day, said she would review the chain of custody and motion for fraud and issue a ruling. The ruling came in writing 2 weeks later. The judge found that there was sufficient evidence to conclude probable manipulation of the ticket and inconsistency in notarization. The court awarded a temporary restoration of my rights to the home pending further proceedings and ordered an investigation into possible fraud. The decision did not feel like full justice, but it felt like a pause in the unmaking. For the first time in months, I slept in my own bed and woke to the smell of coffee made by no one but me. Some neighbors nodded when they saw me, and Ben handed me a bag of bread with a wink. Anna moved out of the house with her belongings. I watched her carry boxes to a car owned by Greg, and I recall the strange hollow in my chest when I saw David walking with her, as if tethered to a version of himself I could not reach. The community watched and commented in the grocery store and in church, and the local paper ran subsequent pieces about the case. There was a sense that a boundary had been redrawn, not only legally but socially. People who had not spoken to me began to ask how I was doing. In the months following the court's decision, life shifted toward repair. I applied for a small grant through an NGO that supports elders at risk of financial exploitation and received assistance to pay for legal fees and to reinstall a safer lock on my door. The NGO also helped me set up an appointment with a social worker named Tanya, who helped me draft rules for visiting relatives and set up an automatic deposit system so I would not have to carry cash or handle risky transactions. We established a trust with a local attorney named Mark that ensured any future transfer of property required multiple signatures and an independent trustee. I learned to set boundaries and to be both gentle and firm. I began to speak publicly about exploitation and financial abuse in a town hall hosted by the parish, and some neighbors came to listen. I also learned that forgiveness can be set like a boundary. I could forgive and still require consequences. Anna reached out once with a message that said, "I am sorry for how things happened." I did not respond at first. When I did reply, I said, "I accept an apology when there is accountability." Her silence afterward was a kind of answer. 1 month after the ruling, I wrote a short piece for the Ridgeview Gazette about what elders should watch for. It was practical and frank and included steps such as keeping copies of documents in a safe, registering online accounts with separate emails, and sharing estate plans with trusted counsel rather than informal notes. I invited readers to a workshop at the community center where I would speak about safeguarding small savings. The workshop had a modest attendance, but people told me it felt important. The smell of coffee and the creak of chairs became a kind of comfort. 3 months after the ruling, I had established a small fund with the help of donors from the town and the NGO for emergency needs for seniors. It was small, just enough to help cover 1 month of utilities or a fare to a doctor, but it was tangible, and it was named Rainy Day Fund in a nod to the tin I had once used. We created a simple application and an oversight committee that included Rosa and Ben. The fund became a practical legacy and a public statement that the community would not allow elders to be pushed out. 6 months later, there were broader changes. The court had moved forward with a criminal inquiry into irregular notarization practices at one of the offices Anna had used to validate documents. The process moved slowly, but it produced a hearing and a public audit that led to tighter procedures for notary confirmations in our county. The house remained mine. David and I met occasionally with a counselor named Elaine to talk about the rupture. Our conversations were honest and messy. He admitted his confusion and his fear about money. He said the pressure to provide had made him make choices that hurt those he loved. We spoke about trust and the long, slow work of rebuilding. It has not been a neat reconciliation. We have small agreements and boundaries, like separate bank accounts and scheduled family dinners that leave room for conversation. The Rainy Day Fund continues to operate and has helped 3 families in our town with emergency needs. We installed a community ledger at the library with anonymous notes about resources and warnings. The town changed in small ways, and I changed in quiet but real ways. I learned to name what happened, and that naming gave me a measure of power. There were technical procedures that I want to be clear about because they can help others. Forensic ticket validation involves checking serial numbers, barcode integrity, and perforation consistency. A technician uses magnification and ultraviolet light to spot tampering. Banks perform signature comparison by analyzing slant, pressure, and unique letter forms, and sometimes use independent certified examiners to compare known samples. Chain of custody is documented by logging each person who handled physical evidence with timestamps and signatures, and any gap may weaken the artifact. Temporary injunctions are civil tools that can halt transfers pending full hearings, but do not constitute final rulings. Knowing these basic steps can help someone prepare documentation and anticipate procedural timelines. If this story moved you, I understand the mix of anger and compassion you might feel. It is natural to want to ask how someone could do this to a mother who raised their child. You might have your own story. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted at home? Tell me the city you are watching from and one word that describes how it felt. Your comments do more than fill a box. They create a small community of witnesses. I read many of them, and some of your words will shape future episodes where we unpack practical steps and lessons learned. Your one word can be a map for others who might be listening in silence. Now let me tell you the rest of what happened after the hearing and how the piece of paper that started all this finally led to a communal change. In the quieter months after the tumult, I found ways to turn a story of harm into a project of protection. The Rainy Day Fund became a small local example of prevention rather than charity, with a board, simple bylaw, and an annual accounting that we made public at the town hall. We organized a small training at the library about common scams targeting elders. I testified at a county meeting with the auditor about notarization practices and showed documentation that illustrated gaps in verification. The county clerk announced reviews and the state issued guidelines for stricter notary protocols. I was not seeking fame. I was seeking safeguards. My son and I slowly worked on mending a relationship through small, reliable actions rather than grand statements. He agreed to a trustee arrangement for any large financial moves and to regular financial counseling. Anna moved away and later was involved in a mediation with the court that required restitution where possible. She sent a short letter expressing regret and acknowledging the hurt. I did not close the door entirely on the possibility of reconciliation, But I did require that any future interaction be mediated and formalized. When I look back, the object that kept coming into the story was a small folded note and a ticket. They were symbols of an older life of modest security and the way something small can become a wedge. The rituals of making coffee, of setting a table, of sitting on the same chair and watching the light move across the floor taught me that home is both a place and a practice. The final reflection I can offer is this: trust is a form of currency. It is earned slowly and spent easily. Justice can appear in small increments, and community can become the scaffold that holds those increments together. If you are an elder, document what you have. Share your plans with a trusted third party and keep transparent records. If you are a child of someone like me, watch for subtle shifts and be willing to step in when you see them. If you are new to a family, remember that a kindness that strips an elder of dignity is not generosity. If this story touched you, subscribe to hear more accounts that combine practical steps and human experience. We are building a place where dignity matters. Leave a comment, share where you write from, and add one word about how this made you feel. Your voice helps others know they are not alone. At the end of a long, windy road of hurt, the thing I learned is simple and stubborn. Justice is not always dramatic. Sometimes justice is a neighbor who notices, a clerk who keeps a copy of a receipt, and a judge who chooses to listen. In the home where the kettle still whistles, I make coffee each morning and set it on the same table where I once folded towels. The steam rises and smells like rain and new pages. I keep the photograph of Peter in a place of honor, and the rainy day fund ledger sits on a shelf that people can see. The last line of this story is a small truth I now carry with me. Dignity can be reclaimed when the community remembers to hold the light. If this reached you, leave a note. Your witness is part of the repair.